When
Mhm.
did you first come across this, by the way? Um,
So I had heard about Barbarian on, I don't know, one of the many podcasts I listened to when it first came
oh
out, but
yeah.
and it was kind of just people were talking about it a lot when it came out, which we'll kind of get into why.
Mm,
But I hadn't actually
yeah.
seen it until maybe 3, 4 weeks ago. I
Oh,
saw that it
really?
was on, yeah, I saw that it was on Max, and I was like, it's short enough where I can squeeze this in, which sometimes is the reason I have to pick movies these days. Um,
Yeah.
and I watched it. I knew nothing about it, which is exactly the way you should go into this movie. And
Yeah.
it just kind of stuck with me. So when we were talking about like both what movies should be watched for this, but also like as independent filmmakers, what's possible on low budget, I was like, this people should
Mm.
watch this movie.
Yeah, so today we're going to be talking about the 2022 film Barbarian. It was written and directed by Zach Cregger. Yeah, really, really fascinating, really interesting film. And um, this was his directorial debut, writing and directorial debut. I also knew nothing about this film going into it. Really sort of compelling start. I think the first 30 minutes is quite gripping. The filmmakers do a really nice job setting things up. Um, we obviously get this Norman Bates sort of energy from Keith, um, from Skarsgård, who's terrific in it.
Hmm.
Um, what were your initial impressions, Tom?
Yeah, I mean, I guess we'll probably get into spoilers pretty early, but I'll try to give my initial impressions before, and then with this movie specifically, I think we'll have to kind of denote to people, hey, if you haven't seen this yet, don't
Yes,
listen
yes,
at a certain
absolutely.
point.
Yeah.
Um, but I really enjoyed it. As you say, I don't know whether it's like 30 or 40 minutes, but there's a point in this movie where it's a very strong delineation. And I thought everything, before that, I thought the whole thing was good, but I thought everything before that point, especially, was just really well done. I
Yeah.
thought it showed the importance of casting because, like you said, like the whole
Mm,
Keith character, like just so everybody knows, like the premise here, you have a young woman goes to like kind of an Airbnb type thing, finds that there's somebody staying there already. It's a young man, and of course that setup alone is enough because we know we live in a world like that setup alone is enough to be a scary situation for the young woman, right? And they do two things really well. One, they make that obvious, like they point that out, right? She's like, "Hey, I'm the one who should be scared in this situation because you're the man." Like that's just the reality of life right now. And then two, the Keith character does everything that I think someone who's not, uh, you know, doesn't have bad intentions would do in order to try to make the woman more comfortable, right? It's like you can have the bedroom, there's a lock on the door, you can with the wine scene, like I'm not even gonna open the bottle of wine yet. You can see it be open. Like he does
mm,
everything to sort of act like a gentleman, be nice. Um, so that was nice too. It wasn't like, oh, well, why is this guy doing things that are creepy? Like he should be going out of his way to not be creepy, and he does do that. So I thought that was really refreshing. I also thought that that's where casting is so important because, like you said, like Skarsgård, he does do everything in a totally like gentlemanly way, but he's kind of so scary innately that he can
mm,
do that and there's still that tension there. Whereas if he was like a totally unassuming actor and he was really actually disarming, then it becomes like, wait, is this a romantic comedy setup? And you never really
right.
get that feeling here. You always feel like I'm a little bit scared for her, even though the actions of the character like are totally like he doesn't really do anything that in of itself the action is creepy because he's not actually a creepy character, but just because it's him doing it, there is always that like element of like, what's he really doing? Like, did he do something to that bottle and recork it somehow? Did he, you know,
Mm,
there's a moment where he's like changing the duvet cover and he like looks like a literal like a fake ghost with a sheet over him and he's like, I'm gonna need your help. And it's just like they're literally just folding a sheet essentially, a duvet cover. But the fact that she has to take a step toward him, it's like a moment of tension. It's like, oh no, is he going to grab her? So there's like a
yeah.
lot of those moments I think that are really handled really well. And in general, overall thoughts was I think that the first again, 40 minutes of this are a great example of like what could be a short film that a filmmaker, student filmmaker I mean, not in terms of quality, but I mean in terms of budget, that a young filmmaker could look to make and would have a great example of a film, right? You don't need a lot of budget. You don't need a lot of, it's one location, you need two actors, and it shows what you can do with very little if you do it sort of in a way that is handled really well.
Yeah, yeah, I would absolutely agree. It's almost like the his mannerisms, right? Keith's sort of awkwardness, and it makes it even creepier. Right. If he were a confident sort of, yeah, suave person, then yeah, those scenes wouldn't have worked. But it's because he's kind of he trips on his words a lot, and he overthinks things a little bit. It was very reminiscent of some of those Norman Bates scenes in Psycho, where he's fumbling and I prepared these sandwiches for you, and it's there's something, yeah, there's something creepy about it, and just the way he looks, this tall, lanky sort of, this character, Norman Bates as well.
Just really quickly, it's interesting to think that now because at the time of Anthony Perkins becoming Norman Bates, he was actually not that at all, right? He was like leading man tracked, like
Mm,
handsome, like, and then Norman Bates kind of changed his entire career, but it was very much a departure at the time. Whereas like with Skarsgård, he kind of is playing these creepy characters and seems creepy, and so they're kind of
right.
playing on that. Like I think they're very aware of that, and they use it to good
Mm.
advantage.
What do you think about the music, and the use of music? Does it also kind of play on those like expectations from the audience, you think, or does it kind of subvert them in some sort of interesting ways? What did you think? Because the
Well,
music is very heavy here.
yeah, I mean, you're much more attuned to music than I am, and I should say, like with this movie, usually I try to watch. Usually, everything we've done before this, I've watched them many times before, and I watch them like right
Mm,
before we record. Whereas this, I've only watched it through once, and it was like a few weeks ago, which is longer than normal. And I try to like immerse myself and just enjoy a movie. So I the first time I watch it, so I don't really catch that type of stuff as separate unless it like jumps out at me in a negative way. Um, at the very opening shot, it's not really music, but there's a lot of like when we're like moving from outside the car into the car, there's a lot of like ambient, sort of very creepy, almost like trailer sounds, which is not really explained or part or like relevant to the rest of the movie in any way. But did you, I mean, and then we'll talk about after this, spoilers, like there's a moment with the cut where there's like a big, driving sequence with the song, but where he's singing along to it. But what did you think about the
mm.
music?
I thought it was interesting. I thought it was an interesting, again, maybe kind of playing on those expectations. I don't know, because yeah, that opening was very it was very noticeable. It sounded like voices or like crying
Hmm.
voices, and like after watching the film, you kind of go back and you do think about these things. And yeah, it made me do that. Even with when she's headed down to the basement look for Keith, you hear it's pretty like dramatic music.
Hmm.
And you hear her heartbeats as well. You hear
Hmm.
that, which is very, I don't know if it was frightening, but it was like it felt sort of cliche at the same time. I was kind of wondering what you thought about it. Like, is this effective use of music? Thinking about it in hindsight and knowing now what this movie was.
I think I kind of forgive it a little bit because what it would be attached to as cliche is not the reality, but it wants you to think, right? So, like, the way I
Sure.
interpret that whole sequence is like where you would yell at the screen and be like, don't go down the stairs, like, just go out the front door. Like, that's the moment where you expect everything is headed, right? Like, she has it free and clear,
Mm,
and she's like, oh, I got to go see Keith. It's like, really? Like, no, you don't. You don't have to go down this creepy basement. So, I was thinking at that point, like, okay, he's gonna trap her now. Like, especially once she sees the creepy room with like the mattress or whatever. Like, there's enough there where you're like, this character should not be acting this way. This guy is gonna kidnap her, was what I was thinking. And so all the cliche leads you to that. And then because that's wrong, I kind of was like, okay,
mm,
because they used all the tools at their disposal to make you think what they wanted you to think. So if that makes sense, right? Like if that was actually what happened, then I would be like, all right, it's a little cliche. Like
Mm.
exactly what I thought it was going to be. Um, like it's almost like not the equivalent for me, and this is I'll say spoilers, but it's been out forever and everyone's seen it. But like Squid Game, in the beginning of Squid Game, it was like this mystery, and you're like, what's happening? And again, spoilers, but I was like, I was so into Squid Game. And I remember saying, I just hope they've thought of any, any reason for this other than it's like rich people, especially rich Americans, like having a game at, and then when they revealed that, especially because I think that was also like the weakest episode, um, and the weakest acting, I was like, yeah, I was like, I still love it. I still think it's great, but I was like deflated, right? And so
Yeah.
I would have been similarly deflated if she goes down there even when she shouldn't, and Keith, you know, crowns her on the back of the head with something blunt and then tortures her for the rest of the film.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
It's kind of those possibilities though that makes that those 30 minutes fun, right? Oh, what is Keith
yeah,
about? Like, why is he? It is interesting that, Tess, her character, she seems like a very, very good-natured, honest sort of person. Um, and I feel like she has to go down to the basement, right? Like she can't she can't just leave. She's not gonna just leave him there. There's no way. Like she would like it's not really in her.
I think it's
And
more
also like
yeah.
I don't know. It is that interesting like decision making that that is compelling. Um because she in the beginning she is very cautious, right? She takes the driver's license photo, she locks her doors, she does all of the right things. But like when she sort of starts having like she has this sort of crush on him, right? She kind of looks at his picture, maybe not
Mhm.
crush, but like this, it just interest maybe. Um,
She lets her guard down for sure towards, later
yeah,
in I think. Yeah.
yeah. And then when it comes to when she's by the door and Keith is going down to the basement, it's like, she's, you know, yeah, I felt like, oh, she's gonna go after him. She has to, right? It's in her. It seems like it's in her character to help people in danger.
I think
I mean, did you feel that way?
I think it was consistent with her character, but at the same time, I think it could have been consistent with her character to also be like, nope, and just leave and like call the police. Like I think either of those would have been satisfactory, honestly. And then like it just becomes a question of like what makes the second half, what makes for a more interesting second half of the story.
Hmm.
Um, and obviously they go through great lengths later in the story to prove that like it's impossible to get police there anyway, which is sort of a whole comment on like
Sure.
I think a big part of it was a comment on like the decline of Detroit in certain neighborhoods as well. Like that was very present, although not like overdone. It was
Hmm.
obviously like that's a comment on that. And then there's also some commentary on like when they finally do arrive, the police like they're not helpful at all, and they're kind of like antagonistic towards her. So that was again also like sort of a sometimes with horror movies you're kind of like why not just call the police, and it's just like this does take that as the possible scenario and then it makes things worse, not better, you could argue. Um, so it doesn't just completely ignore that possibility. It brings it up and shows you it's not, especially for certain people, it's not a viable um, thing you can do. People have different relationships with the police, different time, different place. So um, I thought, but even then, even saying that, like if she had been like, nope, and left and did something else, I still would have liked that too. Anything other than like the most obvious, which is her going down to this basement after he's made her let her guard down and then he tortures her anyway, I would have been happy with because there's some surprise there. And like I would argue, like we should probably get into spoilers at this point. Um, that is kind of what this movie has in spades with surprise, right? So like she goes down
Hmm.
there and there's this whole other person who then gets Keith and it goes to black and we get this moment of like for me kind of like sheer joy of this cut to this entirely different character, seemingly this entirely different film of
Hmm.
Justin Long's character like driving down the road in this convertible singing. Um, I for me that was kind of like a glorious moment in film where you're just like, what the hell just happened? But in a way that I
Hmm.
was like deliciously confused and like eager to see where they're gonna go with this. I don't know if you had that same feeling or if you were aggravated or
No, no, yeah, it was exciting. Yeah, definitely exciting. I mean, yeah, what you mentioned about the the police coming and not really helping. Yeah, a pretty powerful commentary, right? I would have been, I could totally see that happening. The police thinking that she's just like this drug addict and crazy. And yeah, in terms of the that cut, how did you feel before we go to that though? How did you feel when you saw the woman?
I mean, it shocked me in a good way. I didn't, I think my first thought was probably a little bit like, oh, is this going to be a general monster movie? And
Mm,
if so, that was a little bit less interesting, right? Like, if it became a sort of, okay, there's people uh, people underground, mole people type thing. We've seen movies like that since like at least the 50s.
right.
So I was like, if this is going to become a story about mole people, that's way less interesting to me than like the truly grounded, like very realistic scenario that is the first 40 minutes that we've seen here.
Yeah.
Um, so I'd say there was maybe a few seconds of worry about that, but then we get that cut so quickly, and it was so
Mm,
obviously not going to be about that 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 was like quickly assuaged, and I was not worrying about that.
okay. Yeah. And then the AJ character, right?
Mhm.
Um, Playing this pretty obnoxious character, this actor, um,
Or
who we
director.
later learn like is, yeah, we later learn that he's a pretty, he's kind of a, he's, well, he's not kind of, he is a dirtbag. Like
Yeah.
what did you think about the AJ character, how he was handled and
I liked it a lot, honestly, because I think it played on like at that point, again, if we kind of almost think of it as two separate movies, he becomes like the new main character.
mm,
And I think because we're following him, at least in the way I watch films, my initial instinct is to want to be on his side because he's the main character. So when you start to hear things like, "Oh, she's lying," um, "I didn't do anything," like she's saying that I raped her, but it was, either we didn't do anything or it's consensual, it's unclear. And so I thought what was really interesting is like the more you get to know this guy, you realize like he's just a spin guy. Like he's convincing others and maybe even convincing himself to a certain extent that he didn't rape this person, but it was actually a really strong example of like what's true in life, right? Which is actions matter, words don't. And so what we get is constantly this guy's words that like it's being blown out of proportion. He didn't do anything. But I think we get to know that like his action is he actually did rape this person. And so, but to the end, he's sort of spinning it and spinning it, right? And then he gets the action where he tries to kill um to save himself, he tries to kill the original main character.
right.
And it's like final proof that like he's actually just a dirtbag, like you said. Like he's not everything was just words. And he is the asshole that you expect him to be. He's a terrible person. Which also then sort
Mm,
of gets you to the place where you're okay with his ultimate fate, which is sort of like a very traditional horror movie approach, right? Like if somebody is going to have a terrible fate, there's usually some negative thing that they have to do to sort of quote unquote deserve that fate so that the audience will feel like less mixed about it. Um,
mm,
but yeah, I thought that was interesting because I thought it was one of the few examples of showing this guy who's been accused of something who is saying that it's all rumors, but it actually is true. Usually, like I
mm,
said, especially if it's a main character, it would be a story about this guy clearing his name. And he's trying to clear his name. He's trying to clear his name and figure out his next move the whole movie. But the reality is he can't clear his name because he did it. So I thought that was for me, that was an
yeah.
interesting take. And I also thought how they tied together this seemingly random person with the story we'd seen before was pretty interesting as well.
Yeah.
Like that he owns the property that this is all taking place at.
Mm. Yeah, I mean that scene where the woman she grabs him and starts like forcing him to breastfeed. I thought was, yeah, intense. It was an intense, but like funny and darkly funny, I suppose.
There's definitely
Scene where
some,
he has no control now, he has no power, and he's the one that's
yeah,
being forced to. Yeah. Um,
there's some darkly funny moments. I mean, for me, the part where like they're out of the house finally and you get this breath of fresh air and the guy that they meet is like, "Oh, she'll never come here. We're safe here because
yeah.
I live here and she's never coming." And then she just bursts through. Like I thought that was
Yeah.
pretty well done because I was kind of
Yeah.
like, I don't know, it was like a darkly funny moment, but still intense for
Yeah.
me. Um,
I mean, doesn't she pulls off his arm, right? She pulls off his arm and starts beating him with his arm.
yeah, yeah, like
I
it's
was
I don't
like,
know. It's
okay.
and it's weird to say because you either know or you don't, but it's like the type of fun horror fun that's fun, right? It's obviously not
Yeah.
like it's grisly, but it's
Yeah.
not torture porn, right? It's like at this
Sure.
different level where you can actually enjoy it almost comedically, even though it's not
Mm,
funny what's happening. But I think it plays exactly the way it's intended to play. It's not a moment where it's just
mm,
like, oh, we did that and we expected it to be gruesome and it's kind of funny. Like I think that whole setup of like, oh, she never comes in here, you're safe in here, like that was very purposeful, it felt to me. Um,
mm,
but yeah, there's a lot of like the power dynamic with the him having to sort of like be her pet underground and then also she's only there because if you when you jump back further that there was this serial rapist who you know lived in that house originally in like I guess the 70s and then took these women underground and then had children with them, so it's still like ultimately all comes back to sort of like this one rapist's sins. um what did you think about that level of it? Because there's sort of like like the inception moments where it keeps jumping.
yeah. I mean, obviously a very like stark difference, like visually. Like it's
Yeah.
almost it looked like almost like this Norman Rockwell sort of painting, right? I think the use of music here was interesting too. Like because you hear this, it wasn't it was pretty obvious, right? Like who this person was going to be. Like just even the music kind of cues us in. It was interesting how like straightforward it was
Mhm.
and how blunt it was. It reminded me of have you ever seen The Vanishing?
I
Have you
don't
seen
think
that
so.
film?
I don't think so.
Yeah, so it's a 1988 film. It's a Dutch film directed by George Sluizer. It's adapted from this novel called The Golden Egg, and it's about this man whose girlfriend disappears from this rest stop. And it is the scariest film I've ever seen in my entire life.
Really?
It is, yeah, it's by far the scariest film I've ever seen. It's a horrifying film.
Hmm.
I've only seen it twice. The first one, the first time because I was so shocked by it. I was, yeah, it was so terrifying. And then just a second time to analyze it and to kind of really kind of take a look at it closely. But I haven't watched it. It's one of those films that like you just don't want to watch again, right?
Hmm.
It's like it's so intense,
Hmm.
and the character is such a cold. It's exactly how I would imagine someone like that to be. But there's scenes I don't want to give away the movie, but there's scenes where like he does what he does and then goes back to his family and just eats, and
Hmm.
truly frightening. There's no music in it, which I think is
Hmm.
very there's not much music in it, which I think it makes it like 1,000 times scarier because the casual sort of nature by which he just
Hmm.
does what he does is some of these true crime stories. I recently watched one. I don't know if you watched the Chris Watts. You know about that case? It's called actually called American Murder on Netflix. You should watch it. It's a pretty like I would say it's a pretty interesting sort of innovative way to cover a true crime story because most of it is done through like police footage.
Hmm.
Um, a lot of it's done through like this police like the police cam like body cam video, and it's like it's so crazy like this just normal construction worker guy he could have been totally been my neighbor. Probably would have hung out with him. Like, he's like a totally nice guy. Is this turned out to be this crazy killer that killed his entire family? Um, or this woman, this affair that he was having.
Hmm.
I mean, just like the craziest thing that really happened. So and this movie, the Vanishing, just kind of, yeah, it just reminded me of all of those terrible tales. They're not tales, they're true stories. Those scenes in in the Barbarian sort of kind of brought me back to this, because it's filmed in such a vivid way, right? Like it's such a colorful and
Yeah.
vivid town. And then those kind of screams really kind of pierce, and yeah, they're pretty horrific at the end. I don't know. It was hard. It was hard to watch. Like, it was hard to watch, and then the subsequent scenes with him, his older, the older, when the serial killer turns older and he's in the basement, and he has all of those videotapes, and it was just, it was pretty, yeah, it was pretty gross, and again,
Yeah.
hard
I
to
mean,
watch. Yeah.
yeah, I think that was like the least successful storyline to me because it was like there was nothing to take like pleasure in at all. Like it was just like all of it was like, oh, this is terrible to watch. I kind of get it because it's like you're giving it the backstory and then you get the moment of like dramatic irony at the end where the serial killer is older and AJ is like in there with him and he's like the dramatic irony is like we know that this guy is the serial killer, but he doesn't know that, and so there's like a cool tension there. But I think because you get so much mileage out of that first jump to seeing Keith in the car, that when it jumped again, it felt a little bit more like gimmicky than like it wasn't as definitely wasn't as like delicious a cut. It was kind of I was kind of like, all right, well,
Mm,
you did it once, like let's just see the rest. It was almost like then it was like I don't have enough, so I'm gonna put sort of three short films together and then tie them in and make it one story. And like that sounds more negative than I actually think it was. 'Cause I do think this is ultimately a successful film, but it seemed like do we need to see this whole thing
mm,
to or even do you need to explain this whole like sometimes we've talked about this when you explain it's just worse because it's just like I'd rather have questions than so it's like I get it, it's there and you get answers to every question you could have in this movie, right? Like how is this woman down there, why is she acting this way, because she has no human interaction, she's just seen these tapes and um there, I get their instinct was like, we're going to make this feature length. So we need to, what we'll do is we'll explain what actually happened here. But I almost wish they had found some other
mm,
way to, uh, I don't know, maybe this is instead of being an hour and 40 or whatever it is, maybe it's just an 80-minute movie and it's fine. And you don't have to deal with like the darkness of this, this 70s guy who's going out and stalking and raping and killing and then having babies with his baby. Like it's a lot
yeah.
for um, what starts off as like I said, a very tight 40-minute short film essentially that's totally in the moment, in the present, happening right now and grounded.
Mm,
And you go from that to like going back 40 years in time, like a flashback. So it's a lot. It's you go that, then you cut to still present day, but a whole different storyline. And then you cut back within it to like the 70s to show what has happened to I mean, I did think it was cool because you got to see what the neighborhood used to look like too. So in terms of like that storyline of like what's happened to Detroit, I thought that was really a good reason to do it. But I felt like in 10 years, if I haven't seen this movie since, I'm gonna forget the 70s storyline entirely. And I'm just gonna like have the
mm,
knowledge in my head of like how this all happened, but I'm not actually gonna
mm,
be directly remembering or affected by the actual scenes themselves, if that makes sense. Because it's like my brain doesn't want to dwell on them because it's just like there's nothing interesting about the story. It's just dark and it's just a guy who's, stalking and raping people. There's nothing different about it. It's just kind of like it's really informational, right? Until we then see him
mm.
at the end. Um And again, that does sound more. I think overall, I mean, I was the one who put this film out there. I'd recommend it to people. I think it's
Hmm.
a film worth watching for sure. I just say like if I had any questions or problems with it, it would probably be that chunk.
I would agree. Yeah. I don't see how that. Yeah, because it also isn't explored in such a deep way, Like it's just about, yeah, like you said, it's just about this guy going around killing and raping
it
people. It's like,
it also like if it were now I'm remembering kind of the feeling I had. Like if it were TV, I would feel like this segment would be justified because there's going to be an episode in the future that's also in the 70s and we're getting more about that. But it's not TV, it's a movie, right? So it almost felt to me
mm,
like when you're watching a season of Game of Thrones and then like maybe there's 10 episodes total or whatever and then episode 6 or 7 takes you with these other characters that are totally different and you're like frustrated because you want to know what happened in the storyline you've been invested in up until this point. And then ultimately, if it's something like Game of Thrones, it's this masterful thing where they know better than you and they're getting you invested in these characters because down the road you are going to need to know this stuff. But in a film that's only an hour and 40 minutes total, whatever it is, it's like I'm not going to see this guy again beyond that one dramatic irony scene, and I don't know if that's enough to justify this. I didn't time it, but I it felt to me like it was a good like 15-20 minutes of the film.
mm.
And it to me like in the ratio that seemed like a little bit too much. Um,
Yeah, it felt, yeah, again, I would agree. You only have so much time, like
I mean, they
to learn
had
about
plenty of
these
time. I just
people.
think it's more just it's to me like it's so some the rest of it is so strong that it
Yeah.
was like for
Uh,
me,
uh,
it's like really that 30, 40 first minutes before that cut, I was like throwing that out there as like people want to make short films.
Think,
Like,
can I ask you then, Dom? Like, then, what do you think then about Skarsgård dying, about Keith dying? Because, like, because it's kind of this old thing that I learned from one of my lab teachers, from one of my writing teachers. He said that like if a person leaves the scene, they leave. It's all of the drama and all of the tension just gets sucked out of the room because he left.
mhm,
It's done. Like that story is done,
mhm.
right? Like because I thought he was so fascinating that the Keith character, like, and him dying was like
But
the story was, and then
but
we
it,
turn to AJ, who's fine. It's fine. Like he's interesting too. The film wouldn't have, well, obviously the innate structure of the film, like this is what this film is, right? It's satirical take on this Keith, and then with AJ, and then with the killer, right? It's like this these three sort of barbarians, if you will, right? So, or just kind of, yeah, again, kind of playing on viewers' expectations or whatnot. But I don't know. These films are hard for me. These especially horror satire or like dark comedy. It's hard. It's hard for me because first of all, they're very, very hard to write. Yeah, Zach Cregger. I think he does a great job.
yeah, me too.
Um, I think the writing is very, very clever. It's very, very hard to do. Um, and I think he succeeds in what he's trying to do and the story that he's trying to tell, I think for the most part. Maybe again, minus those serial killer scenes. But it's hard to get invested into these characters because it's there's such we don't spend that much time with Tess and with Keith. I just like to know more about them. And I think if we had 60 more minutes instead of cutting to AJ, like again, it would have it's a different, it's not the same, it's a different film, like if that
Yeah,
happens,
it's
but
a
it's just
different. I
like
mean, I,
um
yeah, it's
but
just
it's
a
hard for me
different.
because I think I just finish on my point. It's hard for me because like it seems to me that they're so symbolic of something else. And in this satire where they seem to represent different things, and it's very, very clear, um, by the end, like because there it gets comical, so yeah, it's just very hard for me to stay invested in these characters. We learned that Tess is a good person, right? Um, but that's
Yeah,
I don't know.
what do you
I
mean
don't
by like don't you're not aren't you like rooting for her tests really hard by the end? Or like you're still worried for her, right? And
sure. Yeah, absolutely. I am. But
is that
because I
not
know
enough?
what but yeah, but because I know what the film is, right? Like what, when like when the lady is kind of rubbing her head and saying ba, it's yeah, it's there is this moment of, oh, okay, like this is um he's just trying to make a point here, and it's funny it's kind of funny at this point. So it just takes me out of it. It just takes me out of
Mm.
the and in that moment too, that cut actually it is a very smart cut in the story that he's trying to tell, right? It's a very I did also like get this sense of like this joy there. Oh wow, it's cutting to this. He's singing, and it is a very, very sort of brilliant sort of cut there to that new story. But it does also make me like, yeah, it just also there was a frustration there too, because I felt like we were getting somewhere with this story, and then when he dies, it's like it's double edged to me. It
When
is
Keith
double
dies
edged.
or
Like
when AJ
yeah, when
dies?
Keith dies, when Keith dies,
Yeah, I mean, for me, I was following Tess much more than Keith. So for me, I was able to be like, Keith is the threat to Tess. And then it's
right?
revealed that actually he was never the threat. And so that's kind of like his purpose to the story. And so once
Mm,
that purpose is revealed, it's like for me, there is no use for him anymore. So I kind of
exactly.
like
Yeah,
I see what you're saying about like Keith is a little bit thin there because that it is pretty much like he's a plot device in that way. But for me, because I was following Tess anyway, I was okay with that. And also like we always know like horror movies like characters being alone is like the only chance really for them to be scary. So it's like if both of them were trapped down there together, that's a totally different film again and not anywhere near as scary. Right.
sure.
It's like the
Yeah,
fact that when we finally find her again, that Tess has survived by sort of like acquiescing to this mother's uh routine essentially. Um like I don't know. I get what you're saying, but because I was kind of like you said, like Keith leaves the room and his tension, and I think you're right about that, but I was okay with that because Tess
mm,
is really who I was following, um, and so like
I
yeah,
understand that too.
it
Yeah.
didn't really have it didn't I didn't have any issue with that.
Yeah, because it's that's what again, that's what the movie is, right? That's the story he's trying to tell. So yeah, what I'm saying doesn't really make sense. But that's kind of the reason why these films are it's hard for me. Like Cabin in the Woods too. It's just a similar sort of issue that I had. It's like I can't. It's hard. I don't know. I just don't feel this connection that I think I should be feeling with Tess. I am rooting for her, but it's like
Hmm. Yeah, it
there's
definitely
so
takes
like
more for you to connect with um the characters, I think.
yeah. I mean, by the end, there is this sort of like, I don't know. After I watch movies like this, there is this sort of hollow feeling that I have a little bit. Um,
Hmm.
I think the analysis part is a lot of fun. Like, I think that there's something trendy about it. It's what I mean is like it's a good film for I think for film buddies like you and me to kind of talk about and sort of analyze intentions of the director and kind of what it could mean, and good for like boyfriends and girlfriends to talk about, even with Keith and his mannerisms, and
Hmm.
it's fun. It's fun to kind of break those things down. Um, but I'm thinking like beyond that, and also like some of the social commentary stuff we talked about of the police and what that will that was kind of meaning, and yeah, the director again, the filmmakers do a really good job. Um, kind of
Yeah,
conveying those messages. But beyond that, I'm thinking like, like what else is there to this movie? Because I always look for, obviously I always look for a character. Ultimately, I always look for
yeah,
strong characters, and it's like I wish there was more of a connection there
yeah.
for me.
I
So
get, yeah. I mean,
yeah,
for me, like both Tess and Keith, like I said, they kind of, for the most part, made decisions that I kind of feel like that's what I would do. So that was enough. They were enough. I was able to put myself in their shoes. Whereas usually for me, it's like I can't jive with the character if they do something where I'm like, I would never do that, right? Um, but like I said, like, did you ever see 10 Cloverfield Lane?
I think I did a long time ago, years and years and years ago.
It came out in 2016, and it takes place in like this sort of underground bunker.
Yes,
But it's
Tim Robinson's in
all
it.
I don't know. I know John Goodman's in it. Um, but my point is the reason I bring it up is because it takes place
Sorry.
all in this underground bunker, and really it's just people in a confined space, and how that can be a tense thing, and you don't know what's going to happen. So I think I love that movie. I think it's a really successful example. That's feature length.
Mm,
I think I think again, the first 40 minutes of this were so successful. Like think about the elements that this writer director had: a house and two actors, and that's it.
yeah,
And he was able to make something that was super compelling for the first 40 minutes. Like that as a short film, if it were a short film, I feel like would have been like an award-winning short film because,
I
or
would
even if it
agree.
didn't, I would have just loved it because it's just really, really effective. And like it's so well done that you could easily take for granted the fact that like the elements are so simple. But like if you give most people a house and two actors and say, write a script that's going to make people feel tense, they're not going to be able to do it nearly as well.
Mm,
Um, so I really feel like you know, in the future, I might even tell people like just watch the first 40. Like obviously I think you should watch the whole thing, but if you're wanting to make something low budget or wanting to like study how you could make something tense with almost nothing, this would be a good example. And like you even yourself immediately jumped to like the scene where they're having tea and cakes in Psycho, right? And it's like
mm,
that's such a tense scene. Like everything's
yeah.
taxidermied and he's this creepy character, and you're kind of like, what is going on? Like that's not easy to achieve. That feeling where it's just two people talking to each other and you get all this tension. So I think that is like masterfully done, actually. Um, and it's so masterfully done, and then that cut is so amazing that it's like I'm willing to go on the rest of the ride for the second half of the movie for whatever it is. I would say, you know, that second half of the film is good. I wouldn't say it's like as masterful as the first half, but it's still like it's a pretty solid film, I think.
Was it scary? Was this film scary to you? Was it like
um
a horror film scary sort of?
i
Is
think
it what you want from a horror film?
I think it was tense, scary, like psychologically tense and scary in
The
that way,
first 40
which
minutes at
the
least,
first
I thought
40
it was
minutes,
very,
yeah,
very,
that's what I'm
very
saying,
tense.
the
But like, what
first
about
40
the
minutes.
rest of it? Did you feel like it delivered on the scares?
I don't remember being scared. I remember being kind of grossed out, which is not the
Mm,
same thing. Um,
mm,
and I also, to be honest, don't really necessarily feel the release that I think we're supposed to feel when AJ is ultimately like done in. You know what I
mm.
mean? Like,
What do you think that was about? Why don't you think we felt that?
um, I don't know, honestly. Maybe just because, like you
Mm,
said, I'm like less invested in general in the second half of the film, or just
mm,
because there's so much humans treating humans terribly in the second half of the film that you don't really feel like good seeing even more of that.
mm,
Like I almost would have rather seen him have to face the music of being a like a rapist and like
mm,
have to have a terrible life, and then obviously that's I wouldn't actually want to see that, but it just didn't, you know, maybe it almost didn't seem like enough for him to die, or
mm.
it just didn't seem as satisfying Like maybe people aren't going to know that he was a rapist now because he's dead.
Mm.
And people tend to like stop pursuing those things when people die, or um, or maybe it was just like the way physically it was directed and done. I was wanted maybe if it was seen visually seen in a different way, it would have felt more impactful. But I don't know. How did you feel about that ending?
Yeah, I wasn't scared either. Yeah, and that's also one of the things. Like when I sit down for a horror film, I do want to be scared. Um, not
Yeah.
scared, not like not like with jump scares. With like I want to be scared like psychologically. I want to be thinking about. I want it to leave like this mark in my that
Well,
I can't kind of can't get out of my head.
I
Like
think
The
it's
Exorcist
also,
does or The Shining
yeah,
does. You
yeah.
know.
I think it's also like when the villain, the monster, is sort of a victim, it makes it harder. Like I
Also,
can't be
yeah.
scared of this person who had one of the worst lives anyone could possibly imagine. Like it feels
And then she gets
wrong
shot at
to,
the end, and she gets killed at the end too.
yeah, like
Like,
it
and
feels, but it
that's
feels
also
wrong to be scared of her. Like she's not really the villain. But I'd say like the
sure.
serial killer is the villain, and then AJ is the villain. But the monster, the mother, is not. She's a victim of her circumstance. She's a
Yeah.
product of being brought up that way. So
Mm,
it's almost like you feel bad for ever thinking she was a monster. And so I think that's purposeful, but also makes it a little bit less satisfying. I don't know.
mm, mm.
But again, like
Yeah. I mean,
I turned off the movie and was already not thinking about any of that. I was thinking about the first 40 minutes of the movie,
I
which,
know.
you know,
Yeah. It says a lot though, right? It says a lot about the first 40 minutes, and then it
yeah,
says also it says something about the second half of it too.
yeah.
Which is I think the only way it could be like in this film, because that's what I feel like that's what he set out to do,
I
to
think it's what he
segment
said it
this
too. I
film.
think it's what makes it different and interesting. I think it's probably the
Mm,
reason we're talking about it because
yeah.
as much as I loved that first 40 minutes, if it were a short film, people don't talk about short films that much. And if it was a feature
Mm,
length version of that film, that would have probably been pretty hard to carry out over 90 minutes, like that
mm,
tension. Um, just because like the longer in terms of duration and number of days that someone stays in a house, the less scary it becomes. It's like we become familiar with
mm,
it. So, and they would
mm.
have to become more familiar with each other. Otherwise, it's like a super slow play. Like, wait, if this guy's gonna do something there, why hasn't he done it yet? Um,
Yeah.
so I think it was really original, which, how often can you actually say you've seen something original? Like that to me is like some of the highest praise. Not that everything in this film is original, but it's very aware of what's come before it. It's very purposeful, and I think there are some truly original things in it.
Thank you guys so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed that discussion. If you found it interesting, informative, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing. It'll really help us out. We have some really cool discussions lined up for you, so I hope you're looking forward to them, and I'll see you next time.